Madam Nsi had been selling palm wine for many years, but business had never been this good. On this particular evening, Felix, one of her regular customers, walked into her shop with a big smile on his face. The small shop was made of wooden planks, with a thatched roof that gave it a village feel. Inside, a wooden counter separated the customers from the drinks. The scent of fresh palm wine filled the air. "Madam Nsi, your drink tastes so good. My friends and I enjoyed it a lot," Felix said excitedly. "We asked for more, but Sarah, your salesgirl, said there was none left. Can you believe it? We finished everything. I bought 12 jars, and it was the best we've ever had. Please keep more for us tomorrow. My friends will be coming too." Madam Nsi wiped her hands on her wrapper and smiled warmly. "No problem, Felix. I promise to get more drinks by tomorrow. This is the business I have been doing for years, and I always make sure to buy from the best suppliers in town. Thank you for your patronage. I will make sure you and your friends get more." Felix nodded happily and left the shop. Madam Nsi stood for a moment, watching him go. She was surprised. She had never sold this much in one day. Maybe God had finally decided to bless her business. To be sure, she called out to her salesgirl. "Sarah." Sarah, a slim girl with dark skin and bright eyes, hurried out from the back of the shop. "Yes, Ma. Is it true that all the palm wine is finished?" Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes, Ma. The customers kept coming back for more. They said it tasted really good." Madam Nsi clapped her hands together in amazement. "This is wonderful. All right, let me go to my supplier's shop and restock. But before that, get me the jar of my extracted milk I left in the fridge. I need to take it home to my baby." Sarah turned and went into the small storage room where the fridge was kept. A moment later, she came out looking confused. "Ma, I didn't find any jar of milk." Madam Nsi frowned. "Well, I kept it there myself." Sarah hurried back inside and searched harder, moving bottles and containers around. She returned, shaking her head. "Loma, there's nothing there." Madam Nsi's heart skipped a beat. She quickly walked into the shop and pulled open the fridge. Her eyes widened in shock. The jar of milk was missing. "What happened to my milk?" she exclaimed. A terrible thought crossed her mind. She turned to Sarah, her hands trembling. "Bring me the empty jars of wine you sold today." Sarah ran to the back and returned with the jars. Madam Nsi grabbed one and held it up to the light. Her eyes widened as she realized the truth. Sarah had unknowingly sold her extracted milk for her baby as palm wine. Madam Nsi's hands began to shake. She looked at Sarah, then at the empty jars. Her mind raced. The men had been drinking her milk all this time. Her knees suddenly felt weak, and she sat down heavily on a wooden stool. "Oh my God! What have I done?" Sarah looked at her, confused. "Ma, what's wrong?" Madam Nsi covered her face with her hands. "Nothing. Nothing." She needed to think. What would she do now? Should she tell the customers? Should she keep quiet? Her heart pounded as she realized this was the reason the palm wine tasted different today. Felix and his friends would be back tomorrow for more. Madam Nsi looked at the empty jars again. She had to make a decision, and fast. That night, Madam Nsi could not sleep. She lay on her small wooden bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The events of the day kept replaying in her head. The customers loved her drink. But was it really the palm wine they enjoyed, or was it something else? She had unknowingly served them her own milk, and they had come back asking for more. Should she tell them the truth? What if they found out and got angry? But then again, business had never been this good. By morning, she had made up her mind. She would order more palm wine, but she would also pump more milk, just in case. If people wanted Herb's special drink, she would give it to them. She convinced herself that she was not doing anything wrong. After all, milk was nutritious, and her customers loved it. As the sun rose, she stepped out of her house and made her way to her small shop. The market was already coming to life. Traders were setting up their stalls, calling out to early buyers. The The smell of freshly fried akara and roasted plantains filled the air. Madam Nsi inhaled deeply and smiled. Today was going to be a good day. She arranged her jars behind the counter and waited. Soon the first customer walked in. It was the same man from the previous day. "Good morning, Madam Nsi," he greeted, rubbing his hands together eagerly. "I hope you have my special drink today." Madam Nsi smiled. "Of course I do." She handed him a cup filled with Herve's special mixture. He took one sip and let out a satisfied sigh. "Ah, this is the real deal. Please give me more." Before long, more customers arrived, all demanding the same drink. Madam Nsi served them happily, her confidence growing with each sale. By noon, the news had spread. People from neighboring streets started trooping into her shop, eager to taste the famous drink. The demand was overwhelming. That evening, Madam Nsi locked her shop and rushed home. She secured all doors and windows before bringing out her jars. She needed to produce more milk to meet the growing demand. Sitting comfortably on her wooden stool, she began to pump. The rhythmic sound of milk filling the jars echoed in the quiet room. She smiled to herself. "This is good for business," she murmured. "Tomorrow, I will make even more money." By the time she was done, she had filled twice the usual number of jars. Satisfied, she lay down and drifted off to sleep, dreaming of riches. The next day, a long queue formed in front of her shop before she even arrived. Her competitors watched in disbelief as people ignored their stalls and rushed to Madam Nsi's shop instead. One of the rival sellers, Ikenna, whispered to his friend, "What is so special about her palm wine? Yesterday she was just like us. Today her shop is overflowing with customers." "I don't know," his friend replied, shaking his head. "But we must find out. This is not ordinary." Meanwhile, inside her shop, Madam Nsi could barely keep up. She poured, collected money, and smiled at her happy customers. "Madam Nsi, please give me 2 bottles," a man shouted. "I need 3. Another voice called from behind. Her hands moved quickly, serving each customer with precision. The day passed in a blur, and by sunset, she had sold every last drop. She sat back, exhausted but pleased. Never in her life had she made this much money in a single day. But the success also came with whispers. Rumors began to spread. Some people wondered why Madam Nsi's palm wine tasted different. Others questioned why her competitors' businesses were failing while hers was booming. Some even suspected witchcraft. One evening, 2 young men sat under a mango tree, discussing the mystery. "Have you noticed that since Madam Nsi's business started booming, all the other palm wine sellers have been struggling?" one of them asked. "Yes," the other replied, lowering his voice. "I heard someone say her drink has a secret ingredient. Something that makes it taste better than the rest." "What kind of ingredient?" the first man leaned in, curious. "Nobody knows," the second man whispered. "But we must find out." And so the whispers continued. While Madam Nsi counted her money and prepared for another busy day, the village was abuzz with speculation. It was only a matter of time before someone uncovered the truth. As the days passed, Madam Nsi's shop became the most popular in the village. More and more customers filled her small wooden shop, eager to buy her palm wine. The other sellers in the village, especially Madam Ada, began to notice the change. Their shops were empty while Madam Nsi's was overflowing with people. One evening, Madam Ada sat outside her shop, watching as villagers trooped into Madam Nsi's shop. She tapped her fingers on the wooden counter, frustration written all over her face. "This is not normal," she muttered to herself. "We all buy from the same supplier, so why is her drink different?" Determined to find out the secret, Madam Ada decided to taste Madam Nsi's drink herself. She waited until the crowd reduced, then walked into Madam Nsi's shop and ordered a jar of palm wine. She took a sip and immediately noticed something strange. The taste was smoother and sweeter than normal palm wine. "This does not taste like the regular palm wine," she whispered. "Something is different." That night Madam Ada could not sleep. She tossed and turned on her mat, thinking of ways to uncover Madam Nsi's secret. Finally, she decided she would follow her secretly to see where she got her special drink from. The next morning, Madam Nsi's shop was even busier. A long queue of customers stretched outside, waiting to buy the drink. She kept selling, and soon, all her jars were empty. People begged her for more, but she had nothing left. Meanwhile, Madam Ada stood outside her own shop, hoping to sell her palm wine, but no one came. She called out to the customers, trying to convince them to buy from her. "My people, come and buy from me. My palm wine is fresh and sweet," she called. One man walked in and took a sip from her jar. He frowned, shook his head, and returned the cup. "No, this does not taste as good as Madam Nsi's. I would rather wait for her to bring more, even if it is tomorrow." Madam Ada clenched her fists. She felt humiliated. "I must find out where she gets this special drink from," she vowed. "I will not rest until I uncover her secret." Later that evening, Madam Ada went to Madam Nsi's shop, pretending to be friendly. She smiled and said, "My good friend, please tell me, did you change suppliers? Your drink tastes very different now, and all my customers have left me for you." Madam Nsi sighed and shook her head. "What is your problem, enemy of progress? You want to steal my customers. It will never work. Now leave my shop," she shouted. Madam Ada felt embarrassed. She turned and walked away, but she was not ready to give up. She decided that the only way to find out the truth was to follow Madam Nsi in secret. The next evening, Madam Ada hid behind a large tree near Madam Nsi's shop. She watched closely as Madam Nsi closed for the day, expecting her to visit a special supplier or make a stop at a hidden location. But to her surprise, Madam Nsi walked straight home without stopping anywhere. Madam Ada frowned. "Where is she getting this drink from?" she muttered to herself. She didn't even visit the supplier. The next day, Madam Nsi's business grew even bigger. More people came from neighboring villages, eager to taste the special drink. The small wooden shop was crowded with men and women, each waiting their turn to buy a jar. Some even offered extra money just to get their hands on it before it finished. Madam Ada sat in front of her empty shop, watching in frustration. Hardly anyone bought from her anymore. She bit her lip as jealousy burned inside her. How could Madam Nsi's drink taste so different? What was her secret? That evening, she returned home feeling defeated. She pushed open the wooden door of her house and stopped in shock. Her husband was sitting on a wooden stool, drinking from a familiar jar. She stormed towards him. "Even you," she cried, placing her hands on her hips. "You know I sell palm wine, yet you didn't even tell your friends to buy from me? Instead, you went to my competitor." Her husband chuckled and took another sip. "My dear, this drink is different. I doubted it at first, but when I tasted it, I understood. Madam Nsi gets it from the right source." Madam Ada's eyes widened. "Right source? What do you mean by that?" Her husband leaned back and sighed. "The taste is special, Ada. It's smoother and richer than any palm wine I have ever had. I first heard about it from my friends, and I laughed at them. But the moment I took my first sip, I knew they were telling the truth. Now I buy from her myself." Madam Ada's face darkened with anger. She snatched the jar from his hand and took a sip herself. The familiar smoothness and sweetness filled her mouth. She swallowed and stared at the jar. She couldn't deny it. The drink was different. That night, Madam Ada lay on her mat, unable to sleep. She tossed and turned, thinking about how her business was failing while Madam Nsi's flourished. Even her own husband had abandoned her drink for Madam Nsi's. "I must find out the truth," she whispered to herself. "I will not sit back and watch my business die." Her mind raced with plans. She knew she had to act fast before things got worse. One way or another, she was going to uncover Madam Nsi's secret, no matter what it took. Madam Ada was determined to uncover the secret behind Madam Nsi's special drink. She had already confirmed that no supplier brought the drink to her shop. This meant that Madam Nsi was making it herself. If I have to stay here all night, I will do it, Madam Ada whispered to herself, hiding in the shadows near Madam Nsi's house. She watched as Madam Nsi locked up her shop and walked home. Madam Ada tiptoed behind her, keeping a safe distance to avoid being noticed. As soon as Madam Nsi entered her house and locked the door, Madam Ada crouched by the window, peeping inside. After a while, Madam Nsi came out of her bedroom and moved toward a corner where several empty jars were stacked. Madam Ada's eyes widened as she saw Madam Nsi unbutton her blouse. With careful movements, Madam Nsi began pumping milk into the jars. Madam Ada covered her mouth to stop herself from gasping aloud. So this is the secret, she thought in shock. All this time people, including myself, have been drinking her extracted milk instead of palm wine. She quickly took out her phone and recorded the entire process. She watched as Madam Nsi filled jar after jar, smiling to herself. This should be enough for tomorrow, Madam Nsi said with satisfaction, placing the filled jars in a corner. Madam Ada could not believe her eyes. Without wasting any time, she slipped away from the window and ran home, her heart pounding in excitement and disbelief. She had discovered the truth, and she was going to expose it. The next morning, Madam Ada woke up early. She arrived at Madam Nsi's shop before the crowd gathered. As customers began to line up, she positioned herself in front of the shop and held up her phone. "Everyone watch this," she announced loudly. The men who had come to buy the drink turned curiously to her. Madam Ada played the video on her phone, projecting it onto a small board so that everyone could see. Gasps filled the air as the video played. The men who had been eagerly waiting in line for their morning drink watched in horror as the truth unfolded before them. "Ah, so this is what we have been drinking," one man shouted, stepping back in disgust. "Extracted baby milk from Madam Nsi. Oh my God," another man cried, wiping his mouth as though trying to remove the taste. More and more people gathered, whispering in shock. Some spat on the ground, shaking their heads in disbelief. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse. The once loyal customers of Madam Nsi's special drink turned away, feeling betrayed. Madam Nsi stepped out of her shop and saw the chaos. Her face turned pale when she realized what was happening. Seeing the video, she knew there was no way to hide anymore. With tears in her eyes, she knelt on the ground and pleaded, "Please, my people, forgive me. It was never my plan to deceive anyone. It all started as a mistake. My salesgirl mistakenly sold my extracted milk meant for my baby, but when I saw that people enjoyed it and kept coming back for more, I didn't know how to stop. Business was growing fast, and I just continued." The villagers murmured among themselves, still in shock. After a long silence, one of the elders stepped forward. "Madam Nsi, you have shamed us all," he said in a stern voice. "You will no longer be allowed to sell palm wine in this village." The people nodded in agreement. They turned their backs on Madam Nsi and walked away, leaving her kneeling in the dust, crying. From that day on, Madam Nsi's shop remained closed. No one in the village ever bought from her again. The once busy shop, full of laughter and business, became a ghost of its former self. Madam Ada, satisfied that justice had been served, went back to her own business, knowing she had won the battle.